Hello everyone, welcome to the archives and thank you for coming if you haven't been here before. I'm Tyler and today we have Ciara Ryan with us. And thank you for coming and presenting. She will be presenting on her book that she did on Henry Sieben. And this presentation and book shares about the extraordinary life of Henry Sieben, a German immigrant whose journey mirrors Montana's transformation from untamed frontier to thriving state. He was also an orphaned teen and rose to become one of Montana's most prominent ranchers and businessmen, whose legacy thrives today in ranches that remain the cornerstones of the state's agricultural heritage. Today, Ciara will cover topics such as freighting the open range, the hard winter of 1886, and Henry's surprising links to ranching in southwest Montana. Again, thank you, and go ahead.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me? I guess is my first question. No?
No.
Oh, huh. I thought you were all being funny there for a second.
Let's keep talking.
Is that a bit better? Is that, oh, now I can even hear myself. Yes. Now it's working? Okay, good. Thank you, Tyler, and thank you all for coming today. Thank you to Aubrey, to Lindsay, to Tyler, and all the staff here at the archives for inviting me and Charlene from the Foundation for Montana History to be here today and share with you a little bit about the Foundation's for Montana History's recently released book, Henry Sieben and the Montana Story. And this biography shares the untold story of one of Montana's most notable, yet one of Montana's least known ranchers, and his name is Henry Sieben. Has anybody heard of Henry Sieben here? Oh, I'm surprised. Oh, that's amazing. He was not a Butte man, so I'm actually, but he was a Montana man, so I'm actually delighted to see that. Okay, great, wonderful. He's an intriguing character though, right? And he's even locally in Helena, so even the area where he settled, he's even today still quite an intriguing character. People, and I was speaking to Jim with this just before the talk, people usually most associate his name with that exit sign on I-15 just north of Helena, between Helena and Great Falls, and they know, oh, that's the exit for the Sieben Ranch. But Henry himself, so Henry Sieben, he is not mentioned in any subscription histories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He does appear in Conrad Core's, has anybody heard of Conrad Core's, that rancher? And Granville Stewart in their memoirs, but almost nowhere else. He's not mentioned in the recently published biography of Nelson Story or the Coburn family's memoir of life on the Circle C Ranch. A local historian by the name of Dick Pace, he did write an article, and it's the sole published article on Henry Sieben in the 1970s. And in that article, Dick Pace gives a nice overview of Henry's life, but I really think it actually leaves you with more questions than answers about who Henry Sieben was. So when Henry's descendants, the Hibbert and Baucus families, came to the Foundation for Montana History a few years ago with trunks of Henry's and his daughter's materials and documents that they had kept and that had been preserved and passed down from generation to generation, Charlene Porcelain here, the CEO of the Foundation for Montana History, she let them know that the Foundation would love to uncover his story, and then I was lucky enough to be brought on to dig up what I could about this enigmatic figure. And so what we uncovered was not only one person's extraordinary story. Instead, we started to realize that this German immigrant's journey, it mirrored Montana's transformation from a frontier territory to a thriving state. Henry arrived in Virginia City on John Bozeman's first and only complete trip over the Bozeman Trail in 1864. He was a 17-year-old orphaned teenager at the time, and he was intent on making a better life for himself and his family. And over the next 8 decades, right, yes, 8 decades in Montana, until his death in 1937, Henry transformed from a penniless teenager to a prosperous business and family man. And he was integral in helping create the building blocks of Montana society as we know today. He established a legacy that many of you might be aware of that's still thriving in 2 ranches that remain cornerstones of Montana's agricultural heritage, the Sieben and Adel ranches. For my talk today, he led quite a life, right? 8 decades in Montana, so I'm not going to get to share with you all he did, but I'm hoping to give you a snippet of some of the highlights of Henry's early years here in Montana. So from his arrival in 1864 over John Bozeman's Trail to the watershed moment of the hard winter of 1886 to 87, which some of you may have heard of in the Montana Territory. I hope to illustrate how this orphaned teenager managed to overcome the many and varied obstacles that presented themselves on his journey. Obstacles under which thousands of other immigrants buckled. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll feel you're starting to know, right, this enigmatic figure a little bit better, and that you'd like to read a little bit more about his incredible life and adventures in the biography, Henry Sieben and the Montana Story. And while Henry never did work here in Butte and in the mines here, I will reference his connections here in town. So he had connections with business people here in Butte. And also for a while, he operated a ranch in the Big Hole Valley, just 40 miles south of here. And Tyler let me know just before the talk too that there might be a few people here from the Big Hole area. So I was excited to hear that too. So to give you a little background on Henry Sieben himself, he was born in Germany in 1847. And his family, like 1 million other Germans in the 1850s, emigrated to Illinois in 1852, when he was just 5 years old. Unfortunately for the Sieben family, their American dream was not to be. On the voyage to the United States, Henry's mother fell ill, and she died within 6 months of just arriving here. And so she left a husband and 7 children behind. So Henry's early years, as you can imagine, in Illinois were anything but easy. And after many struggles, his father passed away in 1859. So he was just 12 years old, and Henry and his 6 siblings were orphaned. However, in the early spring of 1864, Henry's chance for a second shot at a better life arrived in the form of 2 good friends, Louis Arnett and Louis Heller. And they secured a prairie schooner and 4 horses, and they planned to travel west. They wanted to leave. So faced with the options of military service, continued work as farm laborers in Illinois, or travel to the west, what do you think Henry chose? Right? He was smart. And his brother joined him too on the adventure. So they headed here for the gold fields. And so on April 18th, 1864, the 4 young men embarked with a group headed west over the Mormon Trail. They paid at the time $90, which would be about $1,700 today, apiece for their passage, including their meals. They took turns driving and walking to ease the strain on their horses. Details are very scarce about Henry's overland trail experience. He and his friends likely began their journey by following the Mormon Trail from Nauvoo, Illinois, some of you may have heard of that area in Illinois, through modern-day Nebraska to the Platte River, approximately 500 miles. They had plenty of company on that section, as nearly 40,000 migrants poured over it that summer. Half of them split off at the fork of the North and South Platte Rivers to take the South Platte Road to Denver. The other half, including Henry and his group, headed for the Montana and Idaho territories. And so they turned north toward Fort Kearny, and they arrived at Fort Laramie in May of 1864. And it was here at Fort Laramie that Henry, his brother, and their 2 friends had their first major decision to make. Officers had announced that single wagons would not be allowed to travel due to signs of unrest brewing with Native Americans. They required travelers to form large wagon trains as they headed west. So now the question for Henry and the group became, okay, which trail do we take and which wagon train do we join? There were groups already committed to the 800-mile-long Mormon Trail, so it was a longer trail around, that went to Crean, Utah, and then headed back north towards Montana. While others at Fort Laramie were considering one of 2 newly established but more dangerous cutoff routes to the Montana Territory. These, of course, became known as the Bozeman Trail and the Bridger Trail. And I think it's interesting when I was reading about Bozeman and Bridger and them being at Fort Laramie, that the description of Bozeman is that he's tall, he's good looking, he was wearing a fringed buckskin, and so you think of these young, impressionable teen boys, you know, and he clearly made an impression on them. And they decided that they were going to follow that guy, the charismatic guy, along his shorter but more perilous route, because it was dangerous, but they were probably going to have fun, right? The 500-mile journey over the Bozeman Trail was arduous, and it was knuckle-biting at times. But on July 25th, 1864, 3 months and 7 days after leaving Illinois, Henry and his group arrived into the multicultural and chaotic town of Virginia City, just 70 miles south of here. They were, as you can imagine, wide-eyed as they explored Virginia City's boisterous streets. They observed the hard work, the greed, the exhaustion, the hurdy-gurdy houses, as well as the casual fist blows and gunshots. During the mild winter and spring since Virginia City's founding, the newly arrived miners had worked tirelessly constructing residential and commercial buildings, including every kind of business, from banks, saloons, to dry goods stores. The town also held a bookstore, a stationery shop, bakery, lumber yards, druggist, hotels, and even a reading room when they arrived in 1864. And freight teams from Salt Lake were making noisy, regular arrivals with supplies. Luxury goods were few and far between, but there was no food shortage when they got to town. So the town was vibrant, right? Not unlike Butte, right? A couple of decades later. And as alluring as that town was, Henry and his party quickly discerned that they would not make their fortunes in Virginia City. Gambling and mining for a quick thrill held little interest for these teenagers. Instead, these plucky young men chose to gamble on themselves. So the group split up. Henry's two friends, Louis Heller and Arnett, they headed south to Utah. His brother Leonard's keen business eye quickly observed that just as important as extracting the precious metals from the stream and hillsides was the need for supplies in the mining camps. And so shortly after their friends left, Leonard got a job with a freighting company, the Diamond Ore Company, and began supplying mining towns across Montana. Henry wanted to save some money before he joined his brother, and so he got a quick little farmhand job with a local rancher in Virginia City. And in what would turn out to be his typical resolute style, once he had enough money in his pockets, Henry then walked approximately 70 miles to the Gallatin Valley and secured himself a wagon and a team of oxen. And this is our first indication of what Henry and Leonard were made of. They were just teenagers, but they were already astute observers of the economy, focused on their long-term prospects instead of a quick opportunity to earn an easy buck. And it marked also Henry's first venture in Montana, and it set the pattern for many subsequent ventures. Intentional, considered steps towards a calculated risk. And it's something we see with Henry over and over again. So soon Henry followed Leonard, and he was running behind Leonard's tracks, running freight over the Mullen Road from Fort Benton to Helena to Virginia City. He also traveled the Montana Road, bringing supplies from Salt Lake City and Corrine, Utah, to Montana's mining camps. And so this gives you just an idea of what one of those freight trains would have looked like. And this is ox teams pulling wagons on Front Street in Fort Benton around that time period. Henry and Leonard, of course, were not the only ones with this idea, right, to freight supplies through Blackfeet and Bannock country. The Mullen and Montana roads were clogged with wagons and stagecoaches endeavoring to reach the mines. Henry's ears vibrated with the sounds of snapping bullwhips, squeaking wagon wheels, and the gruff encouragements of bullwhackers and stagecoach drivers of oxen, mules, and horses. He heard the bullwhackers long before sighting even the wagons. Part of doing business from 1865 to 1870 for freighters like the Sieben brothers and migrant travelers was navigating at that time a maze of unsurveyed toll roads and bridges. These were literally a pay-as-you-go system at the time. Toll collectors built the roads and bridges around geographic obstacles and then charged travelers for their use. And price gouging was a common occurrence at the time. So for example, when Henry loaded up a wagon, he could expect to pay around $40 in tolls on a road between Helena and Corrine, Utah, for example. And that would roughly translate to about $800 today. Of course, right, the freighters passed on those costs to their customers, making goods and supplies even more expensive at the time. Interestingly, Henry did try his hand at various other enterprises while he freighted in those early years in the territory. He worked as a laborer at a sawmill in Last Chance Gulch, now Helena. He also dipped his toes into mining at Ophir Gulch, north of present-day Avon, before hearing of another strike on nearby Madison Gulch at the head of Nevada Creek. But these short spells as a miner didn't pique his interest, and he soon returned to freighting full-time. During Henry's 1866 freighting season, an estimated 2,500 wagons, pulled by 20,000 oxen and driven by 3,000 bullwhackers, traversed the Mullen Road to the camps in central Montana. Of course, many of Henry's contemporaries did find success in the mines or combining mining with other enterprises. For example, William Andrews Clark, right? W.A. Clark here in town. He started out freighting like Henry did, freighting goods in Montana Territory, but then quickly diversified his operations. And Clark's rise was, of course, spectacular. He pocketed $42,000, approximately $800,000 today, from just his placer mining bannock. He ran a successful freighting business to the camps, just like Henry was trying to do, built his fortune in banking, and then capped his rise by purchasing 4 promising copper mines here in Butte, becoming, of course, one of the famed copper kings. But in 1866, Henry, just 2 years after he'd arrived here, Henry and Leonard decided to enter a partnership together. And so they started their own freighting business. And they made trips from Salt Lake City and Ogden in Utah, all the way up here to Deer Lodge, to Helena, to Virginia City, and to Fort Benton. And Fort Benton, of course, was the head of navigation on the Missouri River and the service and supply center for these miners. The Sieben brothers rushed in to help move those supplies. And as the supplies flowed in, gold flowed out. In fact, at least 200 tons of gold flowed out by this route between just 1862 and 69. So for example, one story that when I read this, I thought, oh my gosh, I bet you Henry saw something like this when he was also on the road, was in August of 1866, Granville Stewart witnessed the arrival of a freight wagon in Fort Benton. And it was drawn by 4 mules and escorted by a company of miners. And the wagon was loaded with 2.5 tons of gold dust, valued at $1.5 million, which would be around $30 million in today's value. And the gold came from Confederate Gulch in the Big Belt Mountains and was to be shipped downriver by steamboat. And there's no doubt, I think, that Henry and Leonard witnessed or even freighted similar precious loads over Montana's trails at the time. As the 1860s drew to a close, Henry and Leonard realized that they needed to focus their business interests elsewhere. And why did they think that? They thought that because the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion in 1868. And they knew that when the train arrived in the territory, overland freighting would become largely unnecessary. And so just like he did in Virginia City, and he would do again and again throughout his career, Henry pivoted. And he wasn't scared to do so. He and Leonard turned their attention to the cattle industry. Cattlemen had entered the Montana Territory area before the gold rushes, arriving here as early as 1850. By the time Henry arrived here in 64, the Grant brothers had several thousand head of cattle in the Deer Lodge Valley. The Poindexter and Orr Partnership was running one of the territory's largest cattle and sheep operations in the Beaverhead Valley. And other savvy businessmen, including Conrad Coors, Philip Lavelle, and Nelson Story, had also turned to raising and selling livestock. So, in the spring of 1868, Henry and Leonard tried it out for themselves. They bought approximately 100 head of cattle in Fort Benton for $10 to $12 a head. And the following summer, they sold that cattle back to a Fort Benton butcher, and the sale netted them $90 to $100 per head. And so they were businessmen, and they said, our next venture is going to be? Right. It was a no-brainer. And so similar to how they approached the freighting business, Henry and Leonard took their time before jumping into the cattle industry. So what was interesting when researching about Henry was they started studying their peers' patterns. So they watched Conrad Coors, for example, bring in 1,000 head of cattle to the south bank of the Sun River near Fort Shaw in 1869. They observed how ranchers prioritized water. As the Sun River Valley filled up, these ranchers pushed beyond the Missouri into the sheltered confines of the Smith and Muscle Shell rivers, settling on creeks with various springs and water resources. They noted that most of the breeding stock at this time were Shorthorn, Hereford, and Angus cattle, and they grazed on open, unfenced range. They largely fended for themselves, with natural barriers such as forests and rivers limiting their movements. And so this allowed ranchers to cut small amounts of hay, establishing a pattern of driving herds to the high country in the summer and then back to the lush valley floors in the winter for winter pasture. And so Henry and Leonard gathered this necessary information, and then they started to put their own plan together for what they wanted to do. And in the spring of 1870, they traveled to Corrine, Utah, an area they had been freighting, right, supplies to and from mining camps. And in this area, they purchased 160 head of cattle, mowing machines, rakes, wagons, and other equipment. And they trailed them back to the Chestnut Valley, a settlement which is on the east side of the Missouri River, which is about 30 miles south of present-day Great Falls. And by the fall of 1871, so by the following fall, within just 1 year, the brothers' herd had grown to more than 600 cattle. The cattle industry began to grow throughout the 1870s. And at the same time, the placer mining boom was waning, and many of the miners left, reducing some of the demand for beef at that time. And the Sieben brothers were joining a competitive business, and they were aware of it, but they were determined to succeed. They sold beef each spring to butchers in the still busy mining towns of Diamond City, Marysville, Helena, and Butte. They also sold cattle to purchasers who shipped the cattle down the Missouri River from Fort Benton to Bismarck and from there to Chicago by rail. The daily work of the open range suited Henry and Leonard much more than freighting did. They were strong, they were excellent horsemen, and they were accustomed now to Montana's extreme weather patterns. In 1872, Montana established a brand office, and they made brand registration a territory-wide requirement. So now that they were becoming official and big players in the cattle business, the Siebens needed to create and register their brand. And in 1874, Leonard and Henry recorded their first brand, which was a diamond. And when word of Leonard and Henry's success in Montana reached their family back in Illinois, so their siblings, their younger brother Jake decided he wanted to take a chance as well on seeking his fortune in Montana. And so in 1872, 8 years after arriving in the territory, Leonard and Henry finally received their first visitor from Illinois. And now they were 3 in number, and the Sieben brothers built a substantial operation in the Chestnut Valley, Henry's first real home here in Montana. And this is a photograph of the home ranch of one of the founders of the Chestnut Valley area, Robert P. Thurman. So they were learning to be, at this point, so really early on, within 10 years of arriving here in the Montana Territory, they were learning to be at the forefront of emerging industries. And so they floated, at the time, they weren't content to just, grow their cattle business. They floated at the time the idea of adding sheep to their operations too. And it was actually Henry's younger brother, Jacob, who'd arrived later, who first proposed joining this business venture. At a time when the brothers were navigating a national economic downturn, which had begun with the Panic of 1873. So a typical younger brother idea, right? This is what we're going to do. Large banks on the East Coast that were financing the railroads began to fold, and the collapse sparked high bank withdrawals, failed brokerage firms, and halted railway construction. The downturn lasted until 1878 or 1879. And while other outfits started tightening their purse strings, just like they had done in Virginia City, Henry, Leonard, and now their brother Jake, they again bet on themselves, and they expanded into the sheep business. But there was just one issue. In the mid-1870s in Montana, there were no sheep for sale. In fact, Henry would later recall that there were only 1 or 2 bands in the entire territory. But their younger brother Jake was resolute that the future was strong for sheep. And so in 1875, Leonard and Henry agreed to finance him. And they let him go himself, right? So he traveled to Red Bluff, California to purchase over 2,000 merino ewes at the expense of $6,000, which today would be about $170,000. So since construction on the Northern Pacific Railroad had halted in 1873, Jake had no choice but to trail the sheep back to Montana, a trip of 1,000 miles. Jake's sheep enterprise struggled then for the first few years, but he was lucky he had patient older brothers. They were willing to give him time and learn themselves also about running sheep, something Henry would actually benefit from, right, a few years down the line. Leonard and Henry continued to focus on cattle, though, in the 1870s, and as the Chestnut Valley grew and prospered, so too did their livestock operation. Throughout the 70s, they gradually increased their herd, participated in local roundups, and sold the beef each year in the growing urban centers of Helena and Fort Benton. They were soon expanding their stock to include horses and continued to help Jake as he attempted to make sheep a profitable component of their operation. I'm going to try hold. Is that a bit better? Can you hear me a little bit better? And as the Sieben brothers' reputation as businessmen grew, their activities were often reported in the local newspapers. And there was many, many write-ups on Henry and his brothers' adventures in the Chestnut Valley in the 1870s. One particular one that I thought was funny was an overly, it seemed, excited journalist for the Helena Herald wrote in 1876 that one of the Sieben brothers' 7-year-old cows weighed 800 pounds. And these shrewd businessmen couldn't have asked for better or perhaps more hopelessly exaggerated publicity. Henry also learned that he needed to cooperate with neighboring ranchers on the open range to segregate animals and determine ownership, which of course resulted in the tradition of the roundup. The roundup was a twice-annual cooperative effort to gather all the cattle in a region, sort them out, brand new calves, and trail each herd to its winter or summer range. The roundup was a regular feature of Henry and his brothers' year in the Chestnut Valley, and it usually lasted weeks and meant extremely hard work for everybody involved. Has anybody here heard of Teddy Blue Abbott and his book, We Pointed Them North, right? So it was interesting reading a few of his anecdotes on roundups, and I think I've told this story before, but when you think of roundups, I'm sure you might be similar to what I think of, which is I think of, loud affairs, colorful, yelling, lots of people. And Teddy Blue Abbott gave this lovely anecdote about roundups in which he described the nighttime at roundups. And he described how in the evenings they would gather the cattle in a circle, and 2 cowboys would stay awake all night and they would circle the cattle. But in order for them to stay awake and to also calm the cattle, they would sing. The 2 cowboys would sing. And these were, cowboys from Ireland, from England, from Scotland, from Sweden, from Germany, all these different places. And so they would be singing their own Celtic or traditional songs back and forth, a verse each of their songs as they were looking after the cattle. And I just thought it was a lovely kind of contrast to what you would normally think of when you think of a roundup. So as the 1870s drew to a close, both Leonard and Henry were looking further afield, right? So he never really stayed in one place for too long, right? And he seems to have this pattern that every decade he's trying something new. And so he starts looking kind of further afield to develop business opportunities as well as to find love, right, and start a family. His brother Leonard had traveled to Illinois that fall where he had found a wife by the name of Ciara J. Hines. And Leonard and Ciara returned to the Chestnut Valley, but Ciara could not settle into her new home on the range. And so Leonard, within a year of just arriving back with his new wife, decided that his time in the West had come to an end. And so he would return to Illinois to raise his family in an urban setting with all the amenities such a location brings. And so for the first time in their lives, Henry's and Leonard's paths were about to diverge. And this was a formative moment when when you dig into Henry's story. He had just turned a great number for an Irish person to say, but 33. And up until this point, Leonard had been by his side at every life-changing juncture. Together, they had survived the journey west, travelled the territory's dirt roads for miles and miles, and understood the dangerous beauty of the Montana Territory. They observed and they learned about market trends, had bet on themselves and the stock business. And so they reached the decade's end as established stockmen in Cascade County. But the winds of change were propelling them on their own destinies. Henry decided that he was going to be solely responsible for the cattle operation, but he would no longer have his confidant to navigate the challenges ahead. But after some reflection, he decided he had fallen under Montana's spell and he was going to stay. So it was an interesting period at the turn of the 1880s in the Chestnut Valley. Local and national promotion of the area increased, and so too did the number of stockmen that were settling on the range. And so Henry foresaw issues of overstocking in the region. And so always one to be thinking ahead, he began to look at new pastures for his stock to graze on. He observed that ranchers were pushing eastward down the Musselshell Valley in search of new range. And so he was in correspondence with people that he had met in Virginia City, one by the name of Granville Stewart, that rancher, who had recently partnered with businessmen Samuel Hauser and Andrew Davis, a name that some people here in Butte might recognize. And he was one of the 3 Butte Andrew Davises who were prosperous Butte bankers, to establish the famous DHS Ranch on the southeast flank of the Judith Mountains near Fort Maginnis. Through Stewart and other connections with other ranchers, Henry had heard favorable reports about an area called Flat Willow, an area located 200 miles east of the Chestnut Valley, near kind of where present-day Winnett is. In his typical resourceful and pragmatic style, Henry decided to explore this available land and its potential for himself before making any moves. And so in March of 1881, he rode solo on horseback across central Montana, visiting sheep and cattle ranchers in an area known as the Fort Maginnis Range. Some of the ranchers he visited included, and some of you may have heard of these well-known Montana rancher names, Joe Lepley, James Fergus, Governor Brooks, Granville Stewart, and Len McFarland. And Henry met with them, assessed the range, and spoke with them about their experiences. And on his return to the Chestnut Valley, he immediately sold his ranch. He partnered with a fellow Chestnut Valley rancher by the name of Bob Coburn, and they established a ranching operation on Flat Willow. So he was moving. He was by himself, and now he had the opportunity to move his range. And so at the age of 35, he was one of the youngest stockmen on that Fort Maginnis range. And here's Granville Stewart, a nice portrait of him here. And it's difficult to decipher the handwriting here, on this PowerPoint, but it's an amazing hand-drawn map by Granville Stewart in 1882 of that Fort Maginnis range. And it has all the locations of some of those ranchers that I just mentioned there and more. And it actually pinpoints exactly where Henry and Bob Coburn's ranch was on Flat Willow Creek too. So it was a pretty amazing map to find. So unlike in Wyoming, when Henry settled in this area, in Wyoming they were hearing tales about Wyoming, about armed conflicts over grazing rights, violent clashes between cattlemen and sheepmen, but they weren't occurring here in Montana. On this range, sheepmen such as Len McFarland were open to sharing the land, and they worked easily with cattlemen such as Henry Sieben, Bob Coburn, Granville Stewart, and James Fergus. The enormity of Montana's open range in the 1880s made accommodation of the two enterprises possible. So as Henry grew herds at Flat Willow, he noted how other prominent stockmen had diversified their business portfolio to include investments not only in cattle, but also in banking, mining, railroads, and the arts. And so when his partner Bob Coburn and a handful of other successful local businessmen began talking about the potential of a hot springs and hotel business in the up-and-coming town of White Sulphur Springs, Henry invested. In 1883, he and a group of Helena investors purchased 9 acres of ground on which the local hotel was situated, and 1,000 town lots, for the handsome price of $80,000 at the time, which is approximately $2.5 million today. Henry was intent on making the enterprise a success, and over the next few years, he became actively involved in improving the property and the surrounding lots. He was learning the important lesson from his peers of not putting all his eggs in one basket, a lesson that would stand to him when disaster would strike just a couple of years later. In the meantime, his investment here in White Sulphur Hot Springs didn't slow down his expansion on the range. In 1882, the Northern Pacific Railroad had reached Miles City, thus opening up the East Coast market to stockmen. And so from then on, Henry and his neighbors drove their cattle to Miles City every fall and then shipped them to Chicago from there. In 1883, prices reached $40 or $1,200 in today's value per head for cattle. And with Granville Stewart declaring in 1883 that at Fort Maginnis they had the best range in the West. So Henry had done well, right, by moving his stock over to this range instead of staying at Chestnut Valley. He was working well with the neighboring ranchers too, and helping them solve challenges that came their way on the range. For example, the stockmen were getting increasingly anxious about the invasion of corporate ranching operations in the mid-1880s. Many of these corporate ranchers were driving longhorn cattle north from Texas, entering the Yellowstone drainage from the southeast in the hope of quick profits from minimal investments. Henry and his stockmen, I thought this was interesting too, they quickly put together a plan to deter overcrowding of their range. And what they did was, they did it in the best way to communicate a message right at the time, which was by using the local newspapers. And so every single week, right, without fail, there was a weekly notice in the Rocky Mountain Husbandman stating that the range in the Flat Willow area was fully stocked. So it was a notice there every single week. This range is fully stocked, and any stock growers bringing cattle to the said range will not be allowed to join us in our roundups or to use any of our corrals. So it was quite direct. But in Henry and his neighboring ranchers' eyes, the issue of corporate ranching paled in comparison to the cattle rustling or thievery, which had reached epidemic proportions in southeastern Montana and on the Fort Maginnis Range too. So finding refuge in the Missouri Breaks area in central Montana, a motley assortment of unemployed whiskey traders, wolf hunters, wood choppers, and trappers, they were stealing livestock from the range and taking the animals across the Canadian border for sale. So worried about this rustling at the time, Henry's neighbor and that gregarious character, Granville Stewart, who I've mentioned a few times, he decided to hold a roundup meeting at the DHS ranch in May of 1883. And so Henry and his fellow ranchers, or their foremen on the range, attended. And during the meeting, they decided to employ one man in each county as a detective, whose duty it would be to track cattle rustlers and horse thieves and do all in their power to have them arrested and brought to trial. So that was their solution at the time. It was a start to solving the problem, but they knew they needed to unite in support of the issues they all faced. And so in 1885, Montana cattlemen, including Henry, joined in one organization, the Montana Stock Growers Association. And this organization would yield great economic and political power, and would use that power to try solve the rustling issue as stockmen deemed fit. And they enforced that power in the summer of 1885, when the organization stated publicly that they would not yet take action against these rustlers. Privately, however, which many of you may know this story, right, was a different story. The stock growers' leader, Granville Stewart, held another meeting at his ranch, and it was here that he directed the operations of a group of reliable and extremely tight-lipped men known as Stewart's Stranglers. And like the vigilantes in Virginia City that Henry had encountered when he first arrived in Montana, these men felt driven to protect their interests on the open range. The Stranglers gathered intelligence on the rustlers and prepared to strike. They tracked down and killed at least 15 men they suspected of rustling that season. Henry's name was not included on any of the existing lists or in any recollections of those events. He never mentioned any physical involvement in the raids, but he did financially support Granville's action. Henry maintained a cool head throughout those tumultuous events, and he continued to partner with other ranchers in pursuit of long-term security. So a year later, in 1886, he and 2 fellow ranchers purchased 11,000 head of cattle from Oregon. So he was doing really well right throughout all these events and working collaboratively with the ranchers on the Fort Maginnis Range. Prices for cattle had dipped at the time, but he was still making sharp business investments. So all of his efforts and hard work over the previous 20 years since arriving in Montana, it was starting to pay off in the mid-1880s. He had a diverse and successful business portfolio, he was a seasoned rancher, and was building a solid reputation as a trusted colleague and friend and spokesperson for the cattle industry. And so he finally decided in 1886, over 20 years after arriving here, you know what, I'm ready to settle down, right? I'm ready to meet somebody and make a family. And so he met a lady by the name of Miss Alberta Gordon in a well-attended ceremony and married her in a well-attended ceremony at the bride's home in Whitewater, Wisconsin. And he had met her on his business travels back to that area, and her father repaired wagons at the time. And so the likelihood is that they met through business. And the newlyweds arrived back in Montana. So they married in Wisconsin, where she was from, but then they arrived back in December 1886 to make Montana their home. They stayed at the Grand Central Hotel, and they received friends and basked in the celebration. But Henry couldn't stay in his bride's company for too long, because does anybody know what happened that same time? That was the hard winter of 1886 to 1887. So ceaseless storms and record low temperatures, just as he decides to marry and start a family, hit Montana, and they decimated herds. The hard winter of 1886 to 87 had arrived. And it brought Henry's personal and professional life to a halt. This catastrophic winter for Montana's ranchers, it happened for several reasons. A prolonged and severe drought occurred the previous summer, so in the summer of 1885, at a time when ranges were overstocked from corporate investors. In addition, fall rains did not arrive that year. And there's an abundance of lore, if you read about that time period in Montana's history, about how animals' behavior foreshadowed the impending event. They say that cattle grew shaggier coats, birds migrated earlier, Native Americans talked about heap colds, an ominous event that had happened in the past. So the winter kicked off in November of 1886, and then a series of severe storms engulfed Montana all the way through to March 1887. Henry fretted about his crew and cattle in Helena. But interestingly, his first visual of the disaster was likely a sketch drawn by Charlie Russell, the artist here, the Montana artist. Russell was working at the OH Ranch in the Judith Basin in the winter of 1886 to 87. And when the Helena-based ranch owners, Stadler and Kaufman, asked for an update of what was happening out on the range, their foreman sent them a sketch that Charlie Russell had drawn of an emaciated steer being watched by wolves under a gray sky. Russell gave the sketch the haunting title, Waiting for a Chinook. Moved by how well the small sketch captured the realities of the harsh winter, it ended up being published in newspapers around the country. And it was after this that Russell began to receive commissions for new work. Russell later painted a more detailed version of that sketch, which became one of his best-known works, The Last of 5,000. So when a Chinook did finally arrive in March of 1887, Henry traveled out to his Flat Willow Ranch. The ranges were tragic. There were carcasses strewn all over the landscape. It was so bad that a seasoned rancher such as Granville Stewart couldn't stomach any more death, and he walked off the range that season and never returned. Over 350,000 cattle were lost that season. Henry lost 75% of his herd. His financial security disappeared overnight, a security he'd been toiling for 20 years. But Henry's actions in response to this event are indicative of him as a person and as a businessman. Instead of immediately reacting to the unimaginable losses he had just sustained, he stood back, he observed, and he assessed the situation. He took his time, spoke with ranchers he trusted, just like he did when he was going to move from the Chestnut Valley to the Flat Willow Range, and looked for the opportunities that were presenting themselves. And I think it's these time periods, these times of crisis in Henry's life that really sets him apart from others, because he did this. He stood back and looked and said, okay, how can I solve this problem? And there were opportunities that actually were occurring at that same time. Large ranching corporations, they suffered actually most severely that winter. These East Coast and foreign investors had borrowed at high interest rates, and so they couldn't recoup their money. And so what did? They started closing out their operations and selling their cattle at bargain prices. And unlike many other ranchers, Henry was fortunate in that he had financial reserves from having diversified, likely, right, his enterprises, including investing in White Sulphur Hot Springs. His business acumen kicked in, and he put a long-term strategy in place. He worked with his trusted friend and colleague, Conrad Coors, and they started buying up cattle at those bargain prices. Success did not happen overnight for them, but they worked together over the next few years, and they methodically rebuilt their herds and their stock operations. Like Henry, Conrad Coors had lost most of his herd that winter. But with the help of a generous friend who I mentioned, who used to run the DHS ranch, A.J. Davis of Butte, he wasn't down for long. A.J. was running the First National Bank here in Butte. And upon hearing of Coors' losses, Davis offered him $100,000 on the spot without any security. And Coors remarked that the confidence of such a friend added to my courage at that time. He didn't accept the offer at the moment, but he did make use of the available funds the following year to purchase cattle. And so Davis's help ultimately would be a springboard from which Coors would soar to new heights of success after that. Henry may have also received a helping hand from a friend or business associate. He just never documented it. One thing we can be sure of is that this time of financial need, it greatly influenced Henry's activities later in life, when he would informally help others who found themselves in difficult financial situations. And he really does this quite a lot. Once he rebuilds his operations, he informally helps other ranchers who were in precarious situations, just like likely people helped him at this time too. So over the next few years, Henry and Conrad Coors capitalized on James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad coming in from eastern Montana, as well as the availability of new land in that area. By 1893, Henry had moved his herds not to the Sieben Ranch, right north of Helena, which you're probably all thinking of. He had moved further east, all the way over to Culbertson in Montana. Yep, and he became, within a few years, he developed what would become one of the largest ranches in the area in the 1890s, the Diamond Ranch. He would encounter many more tribulations, but for now, business was good again. And not long after founding the Diamond Ranch in Culbertson in 1893, Henry and his wife Alberta welcomed two daughters, and this is an old photograph of Alberta Gordon, and a picture of his two daughters, Bernice here on the left and Margaret in the middle, and then a granddaughter on one of his ranches as well later on. So they welcomed two daughters, Margaret and Bernice, and they established their permanent home in Helena. And Henry would later determine his legacy by reinvesting in sheep, right? He didn't, once his brother Jake took over the sheep operation, Henry had no interest in dealing with sheep. He focused on cattle. But there was a lovely quote about Henry, and they said that he was never interested in sheep, but he was a businessman, and sheep at that time were good business. So that's why he got back into working with sheep in the 1890s. And so he reinvested in sheep in the 1890s and purchased 2 spreads after the Diamond Ranch in Culbertson, the Sieben and Adel ranches in Lewis and Clark and Cascade counties. And Henry would eventually raise his 2 daughters to eventually take over ranching operations from him. And those are the 2 ranches, the Sieben Ranch north of Helena and then the Adel Ranch in Cascade County, that are still thriving today. So while Henry Sieben is most associated with those 2 ranches, I wanted to share with you just a little bit before I finish up about a lesser known ranch that he operated as well, right? He had a footprint all over the state, right? It wasn't just in the 2 ranches that we know about today. He also was invested in a little known ranch just 40 miles south of here in the Big Hole Valley. In May 1907, Henry formed a business partnership with former Senator and Helena neighbor T.C. Power and Helena rancher Perry P. Klein to acquire and operate the Big Hole Ranch. Perry Klein took on the role of manager of the Big Hole Ranch, spending his summers there and traveling statewide and also wintering here in Butte. After their purchase, Henry got to work immediately, and he traveled quite a lot with Klein down to Dillon to purchase, at the beginning, 480 acres of title land and a school section under lease by the state from Len Pendleton of Dillon. By the following year, in 1908, they had 400 head of beef steers and numerous horses at the ranch. Not long after, the partners had at least 2,000 head of steers, horses, and sheep, so it developed into quite a substantial ranch. It appears it was a successful ranch for a period of time. Henry traveled back and forth frequently to the ranch, assisting with operations, and in 1916 he brought 4,000 head of cattle to the ranch. But at this time, so by 1916, Henry was now in his late 70s. And the ranch was proving impractical. There was managerial problems and high operating expenses, and he was also running those 2 ranches and mentoring his 2 daughters to take over operations for him in Lewis and Clark and Cascade counties. So he disposed of his share of the Big Hole Ranch in the 1930s. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that, you two, that he was, right, invested in business in this area of Montana too. So in sum, final words, in trying to figure out who this man Henry Sieben, who left, I will say, no correspondence after him, what set him apart from the thousands of other immigrants who arrived here in the 1860s was the dream of making, with the same dream of making their fortune but leaving empty-handed. It became clear in trying to figure out what did set him apart that just from looking at the events that I shared about today, that the portrait that was starting to emerge of Henry was a young immigrant boy who, despite having an extremely challenging start in life, as well as a very minimal education, he seems to have been really built for success. He perfectly meshed with the historical moment, the opening of the West in the mid-1800s. He was tough, courageous, and ready for an adventure. His actions throughout his life, both personally and professionally, revealed him to be a man with just a clarity of vision. And he had really a single-mindedness of purpose, which was to build a better life for himself and his family and establish a legacy. He wanted to establish the financial security that had evaded his parents and siblings when they arrived in America. Time and again, he illustrated that he had the innate ability to focus on that goal and harness all of his energy in pursuit of that goal. What's extraordinary when you put the pieces of this one life together is that Henry Sieben and Montana grew up together. Henry witnessed or participated in some of the topics we touched on today. So he was involved in freighting. He dabbled in mining, ranching, cattle drive, roundups, the open range, the arrival of the railroad, and others we didn't have time to explore today, such as the arrival of homesteaders, drought, world wars, prohibition. And through it all, Henry managed to survive, find success, have a family, and establish a legacy that continues today in 2 of the longest held family ranches here in Montana. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about this intrepid Montana rancher. And of course, if you'd like to find out more about his adventures across the state, the book is, as far as I know, Tyler, right, available for sale, Lindsay, yeah?
I have to mention that at the beginning, but yeah, $24.95 if you guys would like to purchase it. You can buy it out at the front desk, and then she might even sign an autograph.
I'd be thrilled to. I'd be thrilled to. So if you'd like to find out more, you can get a copy here at the archives, and all proceeds from this book go back into the Foundation for Montana History, which preserves history across this entire state. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you.
Where's Henry